Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. James D. Tabor and Todd West. And today's discussion is based on Todd's new book, Where Was Jesus Crucified? Text, Archaeology, and a New Case for Golgotha on Jerusalem's West Side. And the link to purchase the book will be in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. That being said, James and Todd, thank you both for joining me today.
It's great to be with you, as ever, Jacob, and I guess Todd, first time, so good to have him with us as well.
So, James, can you tell the audience who Todd is and a little more about his book?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you who he is. He's a friend of mine, although we never met, but he's in my Patreon group and follows my work for years. But I'm going to read from the back of the book. Here's the cover. Always have to center it here. Todd West holds an MA in political science from the University of Georgia. I love it. Nothing to do with biblical studies. And a BA in sociology from Elon University. It's North Carolina. He's extremely interested in the passion of Jesus. In this book, at least, he's interested in other things. But the idea of the arrest, trial, crucifixion, last week of Jesus, some of the places and what sort of makes sense historically, and particularly the location of what's called in Latin Calvary, the skull hill. Where's the skull hill? Or even Skull Mountain. He currently lives in Atlanta with his wife and son, where they also run a property management firm. In his spare time, he loves watching soccer. I happen to know that. I've got to silence my watch, sorry. So the way I would like to introduce this actually is, just a second. I should have done this before. I think that Do Not Disturb does it. The way I want to introduce this, first of all, is a little bit theoretical, Jacob. There's a Carl Sandburg poem that I can badly quote. I think I probably quoted it to you before. But I trained as a historian of religions, historian of ancient Mediterranean religions with Jonathan Smith, Robert Grant, Morton Smith, and others at the University of Chicago, and got my doctorate there. And I'd been to Israel when I was 16, like a family Holy Land trip. My parents are devout Christians growing up. And then I went back once on a tour. But that's before I got my doctorate or anything. So for until 1990, with Robert Eisenman and another scholar you probably know of, Jacob, who's now left us, Joseph Blankensop, the great Hebrew Bible scholar at Notre Dame. They kept saying to me, you need to go over there and get your hands dirty, is the way they said it. In other words, you need to walk the land. You need to go to the places. You sit in libraries and you read all these texts, and you can look at pictures and slides, but, come on a dig. So Eisenman in 1991, December, invited me to be a co-sponsor, my school, of his Dig at Qumran. I shouldn't call it dig, survey. We weren't really digging, but we surveyed, sorry about that. I thought I silenced my phone. We surveyed caves around Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and all the way south to Ein Gedi. And we had teams. I think we had 60 people, and I was over one of the teams. And so we're not actually digging. And a couple of years after that, I dug with Jim Strange at Sipori or Sepphoris, north of Nazareth, and so forth. And I've been excavating in Jerusalem now for 20 years, and half dozen other sites in Israel and Jordan and the West Bank and so forth. So what I did is I began to combine material evidence with the text, and it just made it come alive for me, and it clarified a lot of things. And so that's the general thing. So what Sandburg's poem says, it's about a battlefield. And it talks about, I'll start it, I won't quote it all, but it says, pile the bodies high at Austerlitz and Waterloo, cover them under and let me work. Someday, the passengers ask the conductor, so you're on a train now, going by the site, what is this place? Where are we now? I am the grass. I cover all. So I always love that poem. What is this place? Where are we now? So if I could take you to Jerusalem, as I'm going to do now with a couple of slides, and according to the texts we have, no matter how you read them, I could show you the pavement called the Golgotha pavement mentioned in John, because it's been uncovered now, outside the Praetorium, which is the seat of Judean government occupied by Pontius Pilate, southern wing of Herod's palace. These are things that we can identify with great assurance. You might say to me, if you're real poetic, what is this place, Dr. Tabor? Where are we now? And I would say, well, according to the Gospel of John, which gives all these details on geography, we're standing where Jesus stood at the trial with Pontius Pilate. So we're not talking about, was there a trial? What about Pontius Pilate? Would he have said this? What about Barabbas? What about Joseph of Arimathea? But let's say we're talking about Joseph of Arimathea. Can we identify Arimathea? I think we can. We're not going to do it today, but that's the point. And so the background of this book, Todd is not a biblical scholar. I just read you his qualifications. He's a scientist and a political thinker and so forth, and a businessman. So he's in my Patreon group. And back in 2023, so this is 3 years ago, I mentioned in passing that I had another possible site for Golgotha, Skull Hill. And I joked about it, and I said, I'm almost afraid to bring it up because people are going to say, oh, good, Tabor's got another site. He'll probably have 3 or 4 more, in a couple of years. He's always speculating on things, which is partly true. But I don't have 3 or 4 sites. There are 2 main sites. Todd's going to talk about them. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre. 90% of scholars think that's the place. And a lot of work goes into saying this is the place. Plus a few million people visit there every year. And Easter services and so forth, although this year they were curtailed. And the other is Gordon's Calvary, where mostly non-Catholics go north of the city. And so I don't have a lot of Golgothas. I've leaned towards the idea that it's the Mount of Olives that is east of the city. But before COVID, I like to say BC, before COVID, I began to explore another site on the west side. So this is actually my idea. Todd wrote a book on my idea. He likes to call it Tabor's Calvary. I said, don't do that, because I'm sticking with the Mount of Olives for now. And we could do another show on that. But we want to do this other site. So Jacob, if you put up that map I gave you and make it as large as you can. Is that the full size there? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I don't have a pointer, but this will be fun because you've got your arrows. Let's start at the top. This is north, south, east, west, and you see the outline of the city in the time of Jesus. And it's on the north, it would be not that light colored line, which is the extension, but in the time of Jesus, it's actually where that second little red arrow is pointing to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That's where we think the wall was. Now, there's some dispute on that, but it would be outside the city. And one of the things you get in our Gospels is that Jesus was crucified outside the city. But at the very top, you see what's called Gordon's Calvary. This is named after General Charles Gordon. And the story is he was sitting up on the wall and that would be the wall right below there today, the modern wall. And eating breakfast in a room that's built above the wall with a missionary family there. And he looked out the window and he saw this skull-looking rock formation to the north. And he said, that looks like a skull. And I've always wondered, about crucifixion and Jesus, and I'm going to go look at that. And he became convinced this was it. But he said, there's got to be a tomb nearby, and maybe an olive press or like a garden or something like that. And there's an olive press, and there's even a garden today, and there's a tomb. So millions of mostly non-Catholics go there. I've been there many times. It's very beautiful, and you're in a garden, and here's the skull-looking thing over to the right above your head, and then the tomb. But Gabi Barkai, who died, God remember his name, his name be blessed, as we say. Put the map back up, sorry. I don't know.
There we go.
Yeah, keep it up until I'm finished here. And he discovered that tomb as Iron Age. In the Church Holy Sepulchre, I've never been convinced of. I agree with Josephus. I think that area is where the tomb of John Hyrcanus is located, and that's why Hadrian built the temple over it. John Hyrcanus is the George Washington of the Maccabean period. There you go, great. Okay, now over to the right, to the east, is alternative Golgotha, and I didn't come up with this. Several people have thought of it. Ernest Martin, you might know, wrote a book about it. But I've leaned towards that site because it's in front of the city, and Josephus says that during the siege they crucified 500 people a day up there, and you can see it over the whole city, and I've kind of leaned toward that. Okay, go on down on the map, scroll on down. But here's what I want to show you that might be a key. We know where Herod's palace is. That doesn't move. And we know where the Praetorium is. That's the military side of Herod's palace on the very south. And you see on the map there, it says Gabbatha and the judgment seat of Pilate. Right in view of that, to the south, and it's a little off this map, but I'm going to show you a picture. That's Bible Hill. And Bible Hill is this prominent bedrock skull-like thing just on the west side. And the Mount of Olives doesn't look like a skull. So you say place of the skull, it just looks like a mountain. It's actually goes like this. But this is like this. You'll see the picture in a minute. So I started thinking, is it possible, or possible, I guess but is it likely that bedrock hill mentioned in Joshua 15 verse 8, it's actually mentioned, and it's called Har. It isn't named Bible Hill. That's what people call it today. Tourists call it that. But nobody has said it's the crucifixion ever. And I just started wondering about it, just because of the proximity to the place of judgment. That all you would do is just walk down the road of the patriarchs. It's called Hebron Road. Emek Raphaim, the valley below Hinnom. And you would get to Bible Hill. And anybody coming up into the city would see it, and you'll see how tall it is and so forth. And then I also put on here, just for everybody that follows my work, Tomb of the Shroud, where we found the only burial shroud south of the city. And then the Taupiot tombs are even further south. Okay, next slide. Okay, now this is amazing. This is the city wall, the western city wall. And what you're going to notice is you've got steps going up into the wall. Interesting, huh? This was only discovered in the 1970s. And you see all that growth up above? That's green moss. That's because until 1970, the soil sloped up. Here's the wall. And the soil sloped up like this, almost up to that little crusader niche at the top. So this is a wall built by Suleiman the Magnificent, as he's called, and then later the Crusades, all the way down to where you see the grass. However, right above the grass, are you able to zoom in at all on that? You don't have to, but
when I put the image format as shared screen on that one, so we could zoom in on the map, which was outside of the PowerPoint. But this one's from PowerPoint.
Okay, I'll describe it. Okay. Say you're walking up these steps, and you see on each side stones going up the steps, right?
Here's what I'll do real quick. I can put this one as an image real fast.
Okay. Yeah, let's do
it. Give me 1 second.
Because this is kind of critical to Scott's argument.
Right. I'm pulling Todd's up in a second. I'll be able to. All right.
Yeah. Nah, that's it. Okay. Now, as you go up the steps, I don't know if you can see it, but there is another set of steps carved out of bedrock. Now, when I take people there, I say, let's go up these steps. First of all, I say, it was covered. And can we date these steps? And can we date that walkway on each side going up? Absolutely 1st century. So those steps and then up to the Turkish wall, other steps that they've left because they're literally carved out of bedrock. That's the gate into the Praetorium. The Praetorium is the official seat of Roman government, and it goes into the lower level of Herod's palace where the prison system was, where you keep prisoners. So Pilate's up in Herod's palace, according to Luke. If you want to throw in Luke, Herod Antipas has come down from Galilee. He's staying there. And Pilate is disturbed early that morning. I think it was a Thursday. Traditionally, it's Friday. That doesn't matter for this. So I always say, hey, guys, what do you think? Let's walk up these steps and see where they go. And then we come to a wall. So there's steps to nowhere. They go nowhere. And yet they're 1st century. And that structure on each side is also 1st century. And there's no question about it. Has to do with coin evidence under the steps. Has to do with the way the stones are cut and so forth. Now back out again, and I'll show you something else. Over to the left, right where you're doing the cursor, from that tower on down along the top, just move it along the top there. That's a flat bedrock area. And below it are also 1st century stones. So that whole lower part is 1st century. It's from Herod the Great on, and it leads into Herod's palace. That's the southern entrance to Herod's palace. There's no gate there anymore. So next slide. And this is really important. So here's, I don't know if you know the artist, he works for Nat Geo and so forth, but his name is Balázs Balog. Balázs, I call him Balázs. I had him, I commissioned this painting, and I said, recreate for us what it might have looked like, that site. So you see your steps going up, and then the doorway is there. And then over to the left on the screen, you go up more steps, and you can still see the base of those. And then you get this bedrock supported platform. And the Romans would always have what they call a bema. And a bema is an outdoor area, usually covered by a canopy or a tent, as you see in this picture. and there's a table there, and it's set up, and that's the official seat of Roman government. So when Pontius Pilate sits at that table and signs a paper or any kind of proclamation and stamps it, it becomes the official Roman rule of Judea, because he's the proconsul of Judea. So you've got to make your pronouncements from there. Like, he couldn't just walk along the street and say, I condemn you to death in the name of Rome. That's not how it works. So in the Gospel of John, it's in chapter 18. We're not going to go through it, but if you're interested in this, read John 18, really starting in verse 1, and read until you get down to the Pilate judgment scene. And what you're going to find is an incredibly detailed description of the appearance before Pilate that Mark doesn't have, Luke doesn't have, Matthew doesn't have. It talks about, and he came out, and he goes in, and then he came back out, and then he goes in, and then he came back out, and then he goes in, and then he finally brings Jesus out. So in this picture, I had Blage put a little Jesus figure there. Probably should have put some soldiers around him. And I think he made it a little too high, but that's okay. And the crowd is outside. And this is a crowd early in the morning at daylight that are bringing this Jewish zealot, this rebel as they see him, who's claiming to be king, to the governor or the prefect, wanting him crucified. So that's the scene in John. And John even says they wouldn't come inside because they've already mikvah'd themselves for Passover that night. So this is a real rush job. So that's something of how that would have looked. Then you can go there today. Now, the traditional site is the fortress north of the temple, Fortress Antonio, named after Mark Antony, that Herod named it after him because he and Octavian, who later became Augustus, had crowned Herod king of the Jews. So to honor him, he built this fortress. And the fortress is like the barracks. It's to look over the temple. I can guarantee you that Pontius Pilate and his wife and family, and he does have a family, are not staying in the barracks at Passover. The Herod's palace is so luxurious. Josephus describes it in great detail. It's luxury beyond belief. And much of it's been excavated, especially in the north. Those towers that you see today, the foundations of those towers are first century. So the foundations of this gate are first century. Okay, next. So if you look south from that scene, down the road, you come to this bedrock hill. It's made out of bedrock. And it has this path up to the top. And it looks very much like this in the summer. And in the winter, it turns green all over and it has flowers on it. And in the spring, it's just starting to turn green. And this is that har or mountain that's mentioned in Joshua. It was the border between Benjamin and Judah, according to the book of Joshua. So this is how you knew the border. South of this hill is Benjamin. North of this hill is Judah. And then it ran along the Hinnom Valley and so forth all the way, with the different borders of the tribes. So what struck me about it, and I told Todd this in 2023, and I meet with my patrons once a month on Zoom, the last Saturday of the month. And I said, I got a really crazy idea. And this was after COVID. And I just want to talk to you about it. I wonder if it's rather than Jesus being dragged across the whole city, forget the Fortress Antonio, they've got to get all the way across the city, up the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives is a very steep climb. And and people are passing by and making fun. Well, if you walk at the foot of the Mount of Olives and you want to make fun of a guy up on top of the Mount of Olives, good luck. He won't even see you. You'll see crosses up there, but it's a huge mountain. And it goes all the way down to the south with what's called the Mount of Offense across from the city of David. So it's almost like Mount Scopus. That's where the Romans were camped. Mount of Olives. It's literally a chain of mountains, and it's taller than anywhere in Jerusalem. So the reason I was kind of leaning toward that, or really came to that view, is it would be visible everywhere. But I started thinking, wait a minute, the Romans really like to keep control of things. And there are some texts in Roman jurisprudence that executing people near the praetorium is an advantage, because it's sort of like, let's say a judge has a hangman's noose out in the courtyard, this kind of idea. And you go, you're going to hang from the noose until dead. And then you walk out of the court and they've set it up right there. You could keep charge. And I know this is taking the Bible pretty literally, but I'm trying to locate a place. So Pilate's up in his palace, probably having a wonderful breakfast, and it's going to be Passover, and he's hoping there's no trouble. Now, the last thing Pilate wants is a disturbance. Remember, he's already got in trouble twice for being too brazen with the Jews, like knocking heads and actually killing people, bringing Roman standards into the temple. And he's been told by the emperor, Tiberius, and Sejanus, who's in charge, tone it down, boy. Tone it down. And he's later deposed because of that. So he's not a nice guy. No way. But he also doesn't want to get reported. Now at Passover, if Jesus has any kind of a following at all, and some people would say, yeah, he probably had 10 followers. Well, according to Josephus, John the Baptizer had quite a few followers and was even a possible threat to Herod's rule up in the Galilee. So would he parade Jesus through the midst of the city on Passover, where you could hardly walk? Maybe. I mean, I've tried to imagine it. But what if he wants to find out if they're dead or not? I've walked this so many times. I can walk from Pilate's judgment seat to the top of Bible Hill in 10 minutes, walking at an average pace. 10 minutes. Go down and see if those guys are dead yet, because Passover is coming, and I don't want, a bunch of crucifixions. I'm going to get in trouble for that. I'm just imagining. So anyway, I mentioned that, and I had a video, and I showed it. You can take the slide down now, where we can see each other. Oh, wait, that's my crucifixion site. Now, see what I mean? If you were down on the road passing by, look way down at the bottom of the Mount of Olives, and you're jeering him, it doesn't seem like, I don't think it would bother the people on the top. Now, and the city's in front, I like that, but I'm kind of refuting my own idea here, you see. I mean, I'm open to Bible Hill. Just don't call it Tabor's Calvary. I don't want any names. But I'm wondering if that would really be the wisest thing to do. And yes, they did crucify on the Mount of Olives, but that's because they have a siege around the city, a siege line all the way around. Even Luke mentions this, that they'll set a siege around the city in 70. Well, of course you're going to crucify on the Mount of Olives, because you want people all over Jerusalem to look up and be horrified. Another 500 today we're killing. And Josephus exaggerates, but I think you would agree 500 doesn't mean like 3 guys. I'm talking, in the summer of 70, when they were really bearing down on the Jews. So anyway, now you can take that down. So I'm just wondering whether this could be the place. So, and the other thing, I took my students there. We were digging at Mount Zion. We went up to Bible Hill, and they're all like, wow, but Dr. Tabor, are there any tombs here? Because again, according to John, and he's the only one that says this, In the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden, a new tomb where no one had ever been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, as the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. So I've said, until I'm blue in the face, and nobody seems to remember I've said this, that if you accept the gospel accounts, there are two tombs. There's the emergency tomb. It doesn't belong to Joseph of Arimathea. What does he happen to have a newly carved tomb at the place where the Romans crucified, right outside? I mean, his tombs would be on his estate, wherever that is. But what do you do with the dead body when sundown is like an hour and a half away? Somebody says, well, there's a tomb here. We could just stash him here and put a rock in front of it. And then when Mary Magdalene comes early Sunday morning, again in John, before dark, forget Matthew, Mark, and Luke for a minute, she goes, pardon my French, damn, they've already moved him. Not moved him to say he's resurrected. We put him here during the Sabbath, right? Because you can't, what are you going to do with the corpse? You're out in the field. What are you going to do with, throw it in a ditch or whatever? So I'm trying to fit the geography to the story as a scenario. You don't have to accept the geography or the story, but if the story has any validity. And John is contradicting Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And did you know only Matthew says it's Joseph's tomb by adding one word? You know Greek, Jacob. He puts a new tomb, autou, of him. Oh, really? Joseph of Arimathea happened to be building a tomb right near where Jesus was crucified. How interesting. To me, it just doesn't make sense. But what about, it's not, take out one word, the pronoun, the possessive pronoun, and it says he bought a linen shroud, bought a linen shroud, wrapped him up in a tomb that had been hewn out of rock, and rolled a stone against the door. And Mary Magdalene saw where it was. So naturally, she comes the next day, and they've already reburied the body. So rather, you could say he was left on the cross. He was this, he was that. But if you just go by this text, it just, I started thinking. So then we started looking at Bible Hill. And it's bedrock. And yes, there are tombs, very significant tombs from the Iron Age to the Herodian period. And several of them are still intact. And it's kind of a nice area, like somebody might have been, because it's right across, from the old city. And it's nice to have your tomb outside the city, but monumental. So all along the south, there are tombs. All along the east, there are tombs. Well, why aren't there tombs all along the west? Because the only bedrock side to the west is Bible Hill. So at the foot of Bible Hill are all these tombs, all along and on the south and on the north. And that's where Gabi Barkai found the little silver amulet, with the priestly blessing. It's so famous. But those were Iron Age tombs. So since the Iron Age, they've been building tombs around Bible Hill. And so I just began to wonder about that. So I didn't know that Todd was going to go mentally ill on this, which he did. By that, I mean, I have a job, I have a family, but I'm going to spend like 99% of my free time that I can squeeze out researching Tabor's Calvary. And I'm going to turn it over to Todd. So Todd, you set it up any way you want. You're the guy. And you publish the book, and it's trade published with, it's with Whiffenstock, right? I mean, that's the major publisher, yeah. Yes. And no matter what your view is, get this book, because you're going to find it pretty fascinating. You're on.
The first thing I like to say is that the reason I spent so much time on this book was that the evidence just kept piling up. The evidence just kept coming and coming and coming. So I never planned on spending nearly 3 years of my life doing research on Bible Hill. It was just the fact that the evidence just keeps coming and keeps coming and keeps coming. Since I've published the book, I've already found even more evidence. And you guys will get to hear a little bit of it in the presentation I'm about to make. I discovered actually on your show when you interviewed Dr. The pharmacist, Dr.
Terry.
Recently on your show, I learned another piece of evidence. So it just keeps coming and coming and coming. And to me, that's one of the first indications that this is the historical site of Calvary, because there is no way I could fabricate or invent that much evidence to fit a site. It's just impossible. But anyway, what I'd like to do is, could you please bring up the map and focus in on the southwest of Jerusalem?
Yeah, just give me 1 second. So I'm gonna put it on share screen mode so I can, so that way I can zoom in.
So instead of giving the audience a bunch of rhetoric, I'm going to start presenting evidence. And later on, if they want to ask me personal questions or get to know me, they can do
Is that
that.
the map you wanted, or did you have a map?
Yes. So like from Golgotha down to Bible Hill, so that our audience can orient themselves as I'm talking. Now, a lot of this stuff, the audience may already be familiar with, but just in case any of them aren't, I'm going to present some fundamentals, because these fundamentals are extremely important for understanding why Bible Hill could very well be the historical Calvary. All right. First, the site of Jesus' crucifixion is variously called Golgotha, which means skull in Aramaic, Calvary, which is a synonym for skull in English, the skull, which is a synonym for Calvary, and the place of the skull. So you will hear the site of Jesus' crucifixion called Golgotha, which is skull in Aramaic, Calvary, which means it's a synonym for skull in English, the skull, which is a synonym for Calvary in English, skull, Calvary both mean skull in English, and the place of the skull. All right. In Greek, the word for skull is cranion. Now, this word cranion refers to a human skull cap, where we get the word cranium, or the whole skull, depending on the context. So whatever the case, the site of Jesus' crucifixion has something to do with a skull. All right, now you can see on the map where Bible Hill is located. Around Bible Hill, this area around Bible Hill, I call it the shoulder of Hinnom. Now, that's because below Bible Hill is the Hinnom Valley, as you can see on the map. And the area to the northeast of Bible Hill faces the Hinnom Valley like a human shoulder would. It falls off, like Bible Hill is up here like my head, and then here's the shoulder, and then it just falls off down into the Hinnom Valley. So when I say Bible Hill or the shoulder of Hinnom, it's pretty much a synonym for the same place, although the shoulder of Hinnom would be a little bit more expansive than just the hill. All right. We've already covered the Praetorium, the Judgment Gate, and the Hinnom Valley. And you can see from Golgotha to Bible Hill is just a hop, skip, and a jump. All right. So since we know that the place where Jesus was crucified had something to do with a skull, it also has something to do with the shape of a skull. So evidence indicates Calvary looked like a skull or a skull cap. All right. So Calvary is called the skull in all 4 Gospels, 3 times in Aramaic and once in Greek. In 2 of the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, Calvary, the site of Jesus's crucifixion, is referred to as a place called the skull. So from 2 Gospels, the place called the skull, this indicates that the location of Calvary itself was called the skull, and it looked like a skull in some way or another. You're going to that place. Where? What place? The skull. Now, some evidence for this is the old Syriac Gospels that were written around 200 CE. And in the old Syriac Gospel, Calvary is only called the skull. And in the Peshitta Bible, which is also a later Syriac Bible, it is only called the skull or the head. So in the old Syriac Gospels and in the Peshitta Bible, you will never hear Calvary called the place of the skull. It is only called the skull. Jesus went to the skull. He was crucified at the skull. In the Peshitta Bible, sometimes they say he was crucified at the skull, which is also called the head. Now, these are all early documents, ancient documents, not later documents. So these traditions in the old Syriac Gospels and in the Peshitta Bible represent some of the most ancient traditions and information we have about what Calvary would have been like. Now, all that is relevant to Bible Hill because it so happens that Bible Hill looks like a giant skull cap sticking up out of the ground. In addition, according to the book of Joshua in the Hebrew Bible, Bible Hill is both the head and the face over the shoulder of Jerusalem. That is a clear allusion to the head of a human being sitting over his or her shoulders. This indicates that Bible Hill looked like a human head or a skull cap centuries and centuries before the time of Jesus. This description in Joshua is also backed up by the traditional name for Bible Hill in Arabic, which is Ras al-Dabus, which can be translated as the head of the pin or the head of the femur bone. And Ras is head, and in both cases, the head of the pin and the head of the femur bone, they both look like the head of a skull. So from Arabic, we see they call Bible Hill the same thing, that it's shaped like a skull. So we got the book of Joshua calling it a head over the head and the face over the shoulder of Jerusalem. We got Arabic calling it a head-shaped hill. And you can go on Google Earth today and look at it, and it still looks like the top of a giant skull cap sticking up out of the ground. What's more, Bible Hill is made out of some of the most extremely hard limestone you can have, Medakay Sultani. And that would explain why the appearance of Bible Hill today matches what it was described looking like all the way back in the book of Joshua. It does not erode. It is tough limestone. And we can't say that Bible Hill was cut by modern roads or later quarrying to look like a head, because it was already called the head and the face of Jerusalem, over the shoulder of Jerusalem, in the days of the book of Joshua. So nothing modern made it look like that. It's also interesting to point out that Bible Hill had a quarry on its northeastern slope in the 1st century. And it's possible, based on excavations and photographs that we have of that quarry, that Bible Hill looked even more like a human skull in the time of Jesus than it currently does. We'll never know that for sure, but it is good evidence that Bible Hill has always, since Joshua came there and looked around, looked like a giant skull. All right. Now, Bible Hill is a place of crucifixion. So Bible Hill sits 1/3 of a mile away from Golgotha and the Judgment Gate, where Jesus was tried and led out of the city to be crucified. So this makes the shoulder of Hinnom, Bible Hill, a rational place of crucifixion logistically. He goes out, he goes up to the Bible Hill, and he's crucified. Bible Hill is in the direct line of sight of Golgotha. So as Dr. Tabor pointed out, Pilate could have easily summoned his centurion from Calvary to confirm Jesus' death as reported in the Gospel of Mark. Iron nails have been excavated in the burial urns of Roman soldiers stationed on Bible Hill during the late Roman period. This is important to note because these nails could have been used in crucifixions. This is because crucifixion nails were highly coveted in antiquity for their paranormal powers. So putting those nails in the urns would have provided the souls of the Roman soldiers who were cremated up there extra power to help them in the afterlife. The fact that Roman burials with, the fact that Roman soldiers were up there too also reinforces the idea that soldiers would have been on Bible Hill when Jesus was crucified. Bible Hill is called a mountain in the book of Joshua, as it should be. It's not just called a head, it's also called Har. So it's called the head and it's called the mountain. And because it's a mountain and it's high up looking over the Hinnom Valley and Mount Zion, so a crucifixion on Bible Hill would have been seen from miles around, and its high ground would have been easily defendable, providing security for Pilate's troops. This would in turn explain how Pilate's troops could sit down and gamble for Jesus' tunic while Jesus was on the cross. A crucifixion on the elevated northern slope of Bible Hill would have also struck deep fear in the populace, which is what Romans love to do. And it would have been witnessed by thousands of pilgrims streaming into Jerusalem for Passover along the famous road of the patriarchs down below. This also fits the description of what was happening in the Gospels. It is also noticeable that hard limestone on Bible Hill could have been drilled, making perfect post holes for large Latin-style crosses to crucify victims on. This is pertinent because it shows that every type of cross, from the biggest to the smallest, could have been erected on Bible Hill when Jesus was crucified. In the 1st century, Romans had little respect for the bodies of crucifixion victims, and they would generally let bodies rot on the cross for days before chucking them into pit graves. Yet, in the time of Jesus, this sort of treatment of Jewish bodies would have caused riots in Jerusalem, especially during Passover, because Jewish law demanded that crucified victims be dead and buried before sunset. This is where several strange pit graves on the northern slope of Bible Hill come into play as evidence. The pit graves on the northern slope of Bible Hill were found containing the coins of Pontius Pilate and other Roman governors, and they would have been perfect for burying crucified criminals quickly according to Jewish custom, while still carrying the stigma of a criminal's burial in an undignified pit grave, providing face for the Roman governors. In view of that, these pit graves on Bible Hill could be where the two brigands crucified with Jesus were placed after being removed from the cross. After all, the bodies of these brigands had to be buried somewhere near Calvary, wherever Calvary was, before the start of the Sabbath. Rock scarps dot the northern slope of Bible Hill today, so it follows that they could have done so in the first century as well, perhaps even surrounding the entire northern slope of Bible Hill. You can see a good rock scarp at the apse of today's St. Andrew's Memorial Church on the northern slope of Bible Hill. When you stand underneath that apse, you're looking straight up. It is a lot. Bible Hill is bigger and steeper than it would seem on Google Earth. When you go there, it's big. It's bigger than it seems. All right. Anyway, if the scarps were there in the time of Jesus, it would explain how crowds could get close enough to jeer at Jesus without becoming a security threat. It would also explain how the goings-on by the cross could be witnessed by the disciples, such as the time Jesus drank sour wine without posing a security threat. I mean, if they tried to climb the scarp, all the Romans would have to do is jab them with their spears and they would fall and die. It is also noteworthy that the road of the patriarchs, which still runs past Bible Hill to this day, was a major transnational thoroughfare in the time of Jesus, as all the international coins from antiquity excavated on Bible Hill prove. This is pertinent because it shows that Simon of Cyrene, who was coming to Jerusalem for Passover from Africa, could have been coming in from the country to Jerusalem on the road of the patriarchs when Jesus was crucified. All right. According to St. Jerome, there were several places in his day outside of Jerusalem called Calvary, not just one, but several. And at each one of these places called Calvary, criminals were beheaded. So in that light, Jerome concluded that Jesus must have been crucified at a place where criminals were normally executed by decapitation. So according to Jerome, Calvary signified the place of beheading in Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. This is important because evidence indicates that Bible Hill was Jerusalem's place of beheading when Jesus was crucified, which obviously boosts the odds that it was the historical Calvary. So as suggested in the Talmud, in the time of Jesus, there would have been a cave near this place of beheading where the bodies and heads of the decapitated would have been placed to decompose after execution. This is relevant because there is a cave on the northern slope of Bible Hill, a very unique cave called Cave 34 by Dr. Gabriel Bart, where the bodies of people were inexplicably piled up on top of other bodies, generation after generation, throughout the Second Temple period. At the time of its discovery, no prior example of such a burial cave had ever been discovered anywhere in Jerusalem. And to my knowledge, no cave like it has been excavated to this day. Moreover, in this Cave 34, a lead figurine of a decapitated and bound nude male was found dating to the Second Temple period. This is significant because such figurines were used in ritualistic occult practices, such as warding off the spirits of the dead in the time of Jesus or in the Second Temple period. Also in Cave 34, an amulet was excavated in the form of a grotesque human head. and it was dated to the Second Temple period. These two artifacts could be reasonably said to be indicative of the role Cave 34 played in the public beheadings of criminals in the time of Jesus, just as St. Jerome would have predicted, would have agreed with. In addition to all that, in Cave 34, cremated skeletons were also found, along with a coin from the Bar Kokhba revolt. These charred bones may be the remains of prisoners whom the Romans burned on Bible Hill after crucifying them there during the Bar Kokhba revolt, when Jewish sentiment would not have meant anything to the Romans. The Romans wouldn't have put the bodies into the pit graves like Pontius Pilate would have to avoid riots during the Bar Kokhba revolt. They would have just crucified them and thrown their bodies, let them rot, be eaten, burn them. So it is reasonable to assume that these charred bones, along with the coin from the Bar Kokhba revolt, represent victims that were killed when the Romans could do whatever they wanted. In any case, according to the Talmud, families during peacetime, families could collect the heads and the bodies of executed relatives from the execution site from the place of beheading, once the flesh had decomposed off the bones. This would explain why Cave 34 did not have piles of decapitated heads in it when the cave was excavated. It is worth noting that according to a Byzantine lectionary from 650 CE, there was a place called Golgotha outside of Bethlehem. This strengthens Jerome's testimony that there was more than one place called Golgotha in his day. Plus, since Jerome lived in Bethlehem, it is conceivable that one of the Calvaries he was acquainted with was the one cited in the Byzantine lectionary, and another one was the Calvary at Bible Hill. After all, Jerome would have passed by Bible Hill every time he came to the holy city from Bethlehem, so he would have surely witnessed public beheadings there if Bible Hill was one of the places of beheading in Jerusalem called Calvary in his day. It is also relevant to point out that in this Cave 34, a coin from King Herod Agrippa was found. This is noteworthy because it means the head of James Zebedee could have been chopped off on Bible Hill when King Agrippa beheaded him in 44 CE. There is an interesting tradition among the Armenians that after James Zebedee was beheaded, James, the brother of Jesus, James the Just, buried James Zebedee's head near the Cenacle on Mount Zion in his garden. I only point that out because Mount Zion and the Cenacle is within sight of Bible Hill, and that tradition of bringing the head of James Zebedee, it wouldn't have been, James Zebedee would not have been beheaded in the city, and his head would not have been buried in the city. That would go against Jewish sentiment. But the fact that an ancient tradition connects that head to southwest Jerusalem is potentially telling. All right. Eusebius says that the jailer of James Zebedee was beheaded because he confessed Jesus as Lord during James Zebedee's trial. It would also be logical to assume that Peter's head would have ended up in Cave 34 if he hadn't escaped the clutches of King Agrippa in time to avoid execution. Now, this thing with Peter is interesting because if you read the Acts of the Apostles, and I'm not the only, Dr. Shimon Gibson, for example, has stated that it is likely that Peter was imprisoned in the jails of Gabbatha, right over here on the map, and that he escaped somehow from Mount Zion, escaped Jerusalem. So I'm not the only one who's saying this. When you read the account of Peter in the Acts of the Apostles, you can, he was going to be executed. It was he was imprisoned during Passover, and they were going to execute him right after Passover. Isn't that correct? I'm 99% sure that's correct. Anyway, so he was in prison during Passover. They were going to execute him right after Passover. And the king, Agrippa, would have been living in the palace. So it stands to reason that King Agrippa was getting prepared to humiliate Peter by putting him on trial, sentencing him, and taking him to the same place that his so-called Messiah died by crucifixion, and would have beheaded him at the same place where James Zebedee had been killed earlier. Another tradition says that the apostle Matthias was beheaded in Jerusalem, and the apostle Matthias's tomb may be located just down the hill from Bible Hill, which would be an interesting coincidence if Bible Hill was the place where Matthias was beheaded. Incidentally, if Calvary was the place of beheading, it could explain why the book of Revelation mysteriously emphasizes the beheaded status of certain saints who had died for Jesus. Perhaps if it was written by the Apostle John, he was implying that his own brother was among those beheaded apostles, because he had been beheaded at Calvary, just as St. Jerome tells us would have happened. All right, there's more. Now, some people in the audience listening right now, like me, are fans of Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. John Dominic Crossan. I love those scholars because they keep me on my toes and they make sure that my imagination doesn't go wild. So if you are inclined to follow the thinking of Dr. Bart Ehrman or John Dominic Crossan, then the pit graves in Cave 34 on Bible Hill are the end of the journey for you. After Jesus was crucified, he would have been thrown into one of the pit graves or put inside Cave 34 on Bible Hill, and that would have been the end of it. So if you are, if that's as far as you want to go, then Bible Hill still fits the description of the historical Calvary. However, if one accepts the historicity of the gospel accounts, then there is at least one tomb at Bible Hill that fits scripture perfectly. This tomb is on the southern slope of Bible Hill. It was far enough away from the crucifixion site to have avoided becoming ritually defiled. It was full of expensive chip-carved ossuaries, so it belonged to a rich man like Joseph of Arimathea. It is located in an area that has traditionally been associated with gardens. It was far enough away from the road of the patriarchs that the two Marys would have needed to follow Joseph of Arimathea there to see how Jesus would have been laid in the tomb. It was secluded enough to justify putting armed guards there to make sure nothing nefarious happened to Jesus's body during the Sabbath. It was located near the traditional site of Caiaphas's country estate, where Caiaphas's ossuary was excavated in the early 1990s, and the traditional site of the prophet Simeon's country house. This means the sepulcher on the southern slope of Bible Hill was located likely in an area where someone wealthy like Joseph of Arimathea would have owned land in the time of Jesus. Moreover, and this is very important, either way, whether you go like Dr. Bart Ehrman or you go more a traditional gospel is accurate style, the archaeological fact is the common pit graves on Bible Hill were located in the middle of a necropolis of wealthy tombs around the shoulder of Hinnom where Jesus was crucified. That is an archaeological fact that cannot be disputed. It is also a mystery. But now I'm saying we understand what the mystery is all about. This matches the description of Calvary in Scripture perfectly, especially when one considers that the two brigands crucified with Jesus had to be disposed of somewhere at Calvary before sunset. And yet there had to be a wealthy tomb near the site of crucifixion. Evidence also indicates a stone bridge connecting Mount Zion to the shoulder of Hinnom existed, where the modern Hebron Road Bridge crosses the Hinnom Valley today. This is noteworthy because if Bible Hill is Calvary, it shows how the chief priests could have crossed the Hinnom Valley to reach Golgotha without becoming ritually defiled by the various sources of impurity in the valley below. Plus, according to John 19:6, the chief priests were accompanied by officers of the temple guard at Gabbatha. These officers would have protected the chief priests from security threats as the chief priests made their way across the stone bridge to Calvary and up the shoulder of Hinnom to Golgotha. A sally port, the ruins of a sally port, were excavated by Claude Condor in the 1800s. So this sally port seems to have, that's where, for you who don't know what a sally port is where you have cavalry, and they could burst out and charge people with their sabers and kill them. So a sally port seems to have existed where the Jerusalem City College exists today. If this is accurate, then the cavalrymen could have burst forth, gone down to the stone bridge of Calvary, and provided cover for the Roman troops as they transferred Jesus's patibulum to Simon of Cyrene if anybody in the crowd wanted to start trouble. All right. Later in 65 CE, a Roman governor by the name of Florus, according to Josephus, a Roman governor by the name of Florus ordered a salvo of crucifixions from his judgment seat on Golgotha. The key to connecting this salvo of death with Bible Hill is the location where Florus crucified his victims. Josephus says the crucifixions took place outside of Herod's palace, in front of the tribunal, So it's outside of the palace, in front of the tribunal. The archaeology has shown where the tribunal was. It's right here on the map where you see Golgotha. So now we know where Florus was putting these people on trial and where he would have crucified them, somewhere in front of this tribunal. Well, since there are no quick and easy ways to get, do you see this? Can you see the Sultan's pool right here on the map? Well, you're not going to go across the pool or the serpent's pool or whatever it was. You're not going to go all the way over there to, crucify him up there on whatever that hill was called in Jesus' day. You got to have a road, and you have to have a way to get the people to this crucifixion site. So that also reinforces the idea that the people that Florus was crucifying in front of Golgotha would have been crucified on Bible Hill. All right. However, there was a crucifixion nail excavated in the ruins of Golgotha. So in view of that, perhaps a literal reading of Josephus is in order, and Florus really did crucify his victims right before Golgotha, next to the judgment gate.
I have that nail, so I'm going to go get it while you're.
Yes. Anyway,
it's on loan to us from the Israel Antiquities Authority because we're going to analyze the blood type that was used. So it doesn't mean anything about Jesus. It just means there's crucifixion nails laying around there.
And Florus crucified people there, and it's conceivable that Florus crucified his victims in a mad frenzy of sickening brutality from the judgment gate all the way to Bible Hill. Is possible. But what we do know, according to Josephus, is that Florus did not crucify his victims at the traditional Calvary or at Gordon's Calvary or on the Mount of Olives. He crucified his victims in front of the ruins of Golgotha somewhere. And that reinforces the premise that those crucifixions, in view of all the other evidence I've been providing, occurred at Bible Hill. Now, only 3 people are known to have been called Barsabbas in antiquity. 2 of these people were among the early Christians in Jerusalem. They were named Joseph Barsabbas and Jude Barsabbas. The third is a man named Simeon, whose ossuary was excavated 1.5 miles south of Bible Hill. Since only 3 people in the time of Jesus are known to have been called the sons of Barsabbas, logic suggests Joseph Barsabbas and Jude Barsabbas were likely related to the Simeon Barsabbas, whose ossuary was found near Bible Hill. In addition to that, according to the Syriac recognitions, or sometimes it's called the Ascents of James, that are like a collection of traditions that were put together around 350 CE, but the traditions in the Syriac recognitions are much older than those. The apostle Matthias, who replaced Judas Iscariot, is related to the Barsabbas family. So, as stated before, according to tradition, the apostle Matthias was beheaded in Jerusalem. It so happens an ossuary with the name Matthias was found alongside the Simeon Barsabbas ossuary near Bible Hill. So if Bible Hill is the place of beheading called Calvary, then perhaps the apostle Matthias was decapitated at Bible Hill before 44 CE when that tomb was sealed, and then later, it is possible that the apostle Matthias was decapitated at Bible Hill before 44 CE when that tomb was sealed, and before 44 CE he would have been buried in the Barsabbas family tomb just down the road. This would explain why Matthias disappeared so quickly from the historical record, and it would also mean that at least 2 of Jesus's apostles, James, Zebedee, and Matthias, were decapitated at Calvary following Jesus's crucifixion. And it would also be interesting because, incidentally, if Calvary was the place of beheading, it could also explain why Saul, also called Paul, would have been proud to be beheaded for Christ. Now, there is one weakness in my argument, and I'm going to attempt to solve it, and this is the new information that is not in my book, but it is a weakness, and since I'm an honest guy,
here's that deal while you're going to that.
So, according to the Hebrew Bible, Greek Septuagint, Latin Vulgate, and the Peshitta Bible, David took Goliath's skull to Jerusalem after chopping it off in the Elah Valley, and that was the last place that skull saw the light of day. What's more, it is the only skull in the entire Hebrew Bible connected directly with Jerusalem. So we're already seeing a pattern that there's one skull. Calvary is all about a skull. There's one skull connected with Jerusalem in the Hebrew Bible, and that skull happened to be decapitated by King David. That's a lot of connections. In my book, because of those connections, I suggest that after conquering Jerusalem, David built a monument where he buried Goliath's skull and I say it's at Bible Hill, because and he called it the place of the skull, which in Hebrew would be Yad Gulgaleth. And then the problem is that I cannot find any reference to such a monument in the Hebrew Bible, and that militates against its historicity. So despite the fact that that skull is there and it was decapitated and it was buried in Jerusalem, it's the only one in the Hebrew Bible related to Jerusalem, I can't find any evidence of a monument called Yad Gulgaleth, the monument or the place of the skull. However, I do have one theory that's not in my book, but it's possible. So I suggest that Calvary does make one cameo in the book of Jeremiah. And if it does make a cameo in the book of Jeremiah, as I'm about to say, then the case for Bible Hill becomes even stronger. So according to the translation of Jeremiah 31:39 in the Latin Vulgate, there is a place he calls Golgotha. This is in the Latin Vulgate. Now, many biblical exegetes locate this place called Golgotha in southwest Jerusalem. Now, while most modern translations of Jeremiah 31:39 called this place Goa instead of Golgotha on grammatical grounds, I think the Latin Vulgate reflects what this place was originally called in the Hebrew texts, from which the Latin Vulgate was translated in the 4th century. And we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that there were some differences between the Masoretic text and the Hebrew text people in the time of Jesus were using. And I don't want to get into an argument about all that. I just am pointing out that it's possible that the Latin Vulgate could reflect the original reading, and the modern Masoretic text is not. If this is correct, then Golgotha could be a garbled pronunciation of the local Hebrew Aramaic word for skull in Jeremiah's local dialect. Since I'm from Georgia, I can tell you that the locals in my state call Atlanta Lana. Yeah. So I can imagine that in the local dialect of Jeremiah, Golgotha, or because his Hebrew was mixed. It was already starting to get mixed between Aramaic and Hebrew. So, he may have pronounced it a little funky, like Golgotha, Golgotha, that's Golgotha, Atlanta. Now, that's not enough though. I noticed that in the Greek Septuagint, the description of Golgotha is a circular wall of choice stones. Okay. Now, I'm going to speculate here that this circular wall of choice stones refers to the ruins of David's place of the skull that were still visible on Bible Hill during the Hellenistic period when the Septuagint was being written. Given that Bible Hill is made of Medicae Sultani, which is translated in English as the royal limestone, it makes sense that David's monument would have been surrounded by a wall of elite, nice, chosen stones, totally smashed and ruined by the Babylonians, but the ruins would have been there. Finally, the fact that the place called Golgotha shows up just a few verses away from Jeremiah's prophecy about the new covenant, to me, lends more credence to this suggestion that Golgotha is Golgotha. Now, just a real I don't want to get into all the grammar of Hebrew and all that kind of stuff, but I would suspect, just for you guys who know a lot about it, that later scribes were probably reading the Hebrew, reading Jeremiah, and they ran across Golgotha, which would be towards Golgotha. And they would go like, what's this Golgotha? Golgotha. And then they would think to themselves, that guy just doubled his thigh. So let's just strike that thigh out there. And now we got it, Golgotha, which turns the word into Goa. And, when you mix in Aramaic and Hebrew together, sometimes it sounds funky. I'm not a Hebrew scholar or an Aramaic scholar, but I know just enough to know that when they start mixing together, open vowels, closed vowels, I'm glad, man, those people who study this stuff, I'm glad that they do, because it would blow, those languages, people like Dr. Tabor who know Hebrew, my hat goes off to you, because that is a tough language. I don't care what anybody says. And then you start mixing it up with kind of local dialects of Aramaic, Hebrew, and my goodness gracious. This is just a theory. I can't prove it, but it's a possibility that is the one and only cameo of the place of the skull in the Hebrew Bible. There are tons. The amount of evidence that I have in my book expands way beyond what I just told you, what I just gave you. This is just the tip of the iceberg, and as Dr. Tabor knows, and I also want to say right now, before I go one step further, that over the past 3 years, I would send Dr. Tabor emails with evidence, and he would look through those emails and he would say to me, oh, this evidence is weak. This evidence is okay. This evidence is fantastic. So the final product of this book, could not have been done without his expertise. And it also, the fact that he was the one who vetted all my material as I was writing it over these past 3 years can give you, the audience, the confidence you need to know that it has the sophistication and the rigor of someone with a PhD from the University of Chicago, because Dr. Tabor would not let me get away with anything. And
I'm not going to let you blame me for your wacko theory. Are you kidding?
You didn't. What you did was make sure that the evidence I presented was sound, even if you didn't always agree with it.
The Jeremiah passages.
It's your privately. It is Tabor's Calvary, and between you and me. Well, anyway, I hope that one day.
We're going to go there.
The evidence will keep. I'm certain that the evidence will keep accumulating, and that whether you want it to be Tabor's Calvary or not, I wouldn't be surprised if one day it is called Tabor's Calvary on the Oxford map in the Bible.
I already have another mountain name for me, or me for it, and actually, it's relevant here because you name mountains by shape sometimes. And do you know about Mount Tabor? Tabor in Hebrew means belly or breast. Okay, so if you look at the flat plain of the Jezreel Valley in Mount Tabor, it's either a nice ample Reuben style belly, or a breast. So it's called Mount Breast. So I'm named after either a belly or a breast, but that name was taken by John Huss, the leader of the Hussites, and the Taborites, they're also called. So in the Czech Republic, where my male line is from, the Czech Republic. So, and they were crazy apocalyptic people too. So anyway, this is the nail. I don't think it's been used. But it was near the Golgotha, and which is the place of judgment. So you would think that they would have a barrel of those things, waiting to go. So Jacob, you jump in here. I can say this: Todd's only presented about 10% of the book, although I think what he presented were the strongest points. And I have some objections, but I think we should. Do you have any super chats, or do you want to say anything, Jacob? I can stay a few more minutes, but
okay.
If people are interested, especially if they're asking questions.
So what I'd like to ask, it's about Joseph Arimathea. So do you think that the way that the Gospels talk about him, assuming that all of this is correct, is his role exactly as the Gospels portrayed him based on what we know, what's been discussed here? Or are there some differences apart from the apparent confirmations?
Are you asking me or Dr. Tabor?
You.
Well, that's an interesting question. Assuming that the Gospels are correct, are historically reliable, Joseph of Arimathea would have been walking past Calvary. He would have seen Jesus up there. It would have disgusted him, and since he had the power and the authority, being on the Sanhedrin, to do something about it, he would have gone to Pilate and gotten permission to take his body off the cross and given him a proper burial as a man like Jesus deserved, instead of being thrown in one of the pit graves. Now, talking about Joseph of Arimathea, according to Dr. Helen Bond, and this is an interesting theory. So Dr. Helen Bond, she suggested that Joseph of Arimathea was in charge of the place. Well, she was in charge of the place of execution, the public place of execution. She wouldn't have known about Bible Hill or the place of beheading or anything like that. So I don't want to confuse what she said with mine, but she said that he was possibly in charge of the public site of execution in Jerusalem. And this would have given him authority to make decisions regarding what happened to bodies on that site. And that would explain how he could go and talk to Pilate and explain what he wanted to do, and Pilate gave him permission. And so instead of the normal procedure, which would be to take the bodies down, chuck them in those pit graves right in front of today's St. Andrew's Memorial Church, and put some rocks on top of them until the Sabbath was over, when the family could come and pick them up and take them wherever they wanted. He wanted to show Jesus a little bit more respect than that, and took care of the body like the Gospels say he did. Now, what's interesting, as I was pointing out, is all I know is that there are pit graves with the coins of Pontius Pilate and other Roman governors right in front of the apse of today's St. Andrew's Memorial Church, and they are surrounded by wealthy, elite tombs with gardens. It is, that's just the way it is. That's a fact.
Let me suggest two possibilities, because Helen, I think, is onto something here. I wouldn't, if you're going to be skeptical, and I think we should be, the idea that he had that power because he's sympathetic with the movement and has some in with Pilate, or there's also a tradition that he's an uncle, remember, of Jesus. That's getting into medieval stuff with Glastonbury. He's a tin merchant. He used to take little Jesus on his voyages to England. Okay, that's another whole thing with medieval legends. Mary Magdalene's buried in France and all kinds of things. But if you stay at the first century and you don't want to, and you see that as more apologetic, like how can you explain that he would do that? Helen's idea would be that someone in the Sanhedrin has to be in charge of Jewish sanctity, you might say, but when somebody's dead, you bury them, even if you put a handful of dirt over them, because you don't leave the body exposed. But with that could be the idea that and this wouldn't be recorded, look, this particular guy, I think it's going to cause pilgrimages and riots and everything, but he's got thousands of followers from the Galilee, and you just throw him in a pit grave. You thought you had trouble with the crucifixion. Now think of what you're going to have, or something like that. So there could have been some kind of background like that. Why don't you let me take him and take charge of the burial, and you won't have, a riot on your hands, because that gets into all kinds of things. Was the tomb empty? Was there a tomb? Our earliest account is Paul, as usually dated in 1 Corinthians 15. And he simply says he was buried, right? He was buried. And raised there, it's from the word egero, and was lifted up. So he's buried and lifted up. And then you ask Paul, what kind of a body? What do you mean he was lifted up? He said, well, I saw him. And it was spiritual and glorious and powerful. And the same way all the bodies are going to be like at the resurrection. He had his view of resurrection, glorification, really. We should probably call it glorification rather than resurrection. So a lot of us in the field are convinced that the earliest view of Jesus' resurrection, we use that word all the time, just means to stand up, right? Anastasis. Stasis is stand, ana, up. So the earliest record of Jesus standing up, that's the generic term, was agero, to raise up. And it's called heavenly ascent. It's what I wrote my dissertation on, heavenly ascent. Because Paul says, well, I know another guy that ascended to heaven. Remember? In 2 Corinthians 12. And there are 3 rabbis that ascended to heaven and so forth. So the earliest view might well have been, I think Robin Faith Walsh has talked about this and others, that he was taken up. But Paul wouldn't be bothered with bones. I think that's the case. He says in 2 Corinthians that, using Platonic imagery, that the body is like old clothes. It's not you. The life-giving spirit that he calls Jesus, he said he was raised a life-giving spirit. That's what he saw. So it's if you want to use a technical term, it's what's called an apparition. He saw something in the heavens and said, identified it as the experience of Jesus. And it's the same word used for the paralyzed guy in Mark who lifts up his bed and walks. Take up your bed and walk. Take up, lift up. So it might be a term more appropriate to ascent. You know, when people say he died, he was buried, and he ascended. But the Gospels of Luke and John, particularly Luke, insist on what's called a bodily resurrection. Well, Paul would say, I believe in a bodily resurrection, but not, he said, when you die, you take off your old clothes, your body rots, and then you put on new clothes. But he goes, you don't want to be found naked. That's the interim state. That was his view of death. So it would be like you have some old rotten clothes, because dead bodies are rotting. And you now are given new glorious clothes. That's his analogy. And you go, well, I still want those old clothes. I know they stink and they're all full of holes, but I just like those clothes. I still want to wear them. Paul's trying to be, he's making fun of Neoplatonism. He says, not like we want to be naked, but we want to be reclothed in a body. So he believed in a bodily resurrection. He says there's a physical body and there's a wind body. A wind body is not, and he says, and it's not flesh and blood. So, but Luke, as you know, is very worried about apologetics. And Jacob and I have done whole programs on this. And he's afraid that if you say that, you'll have the Celsus objection, right? And what's the Celsus objection? So a bunch of hysterical women and unstable people claim they saw something and you're basing a whole cosmic new religion on it. What is wrong with you? Where's your rationality? Whereas in Greco-Roman religion, if you believe somebody's raised up to heaven and becomes a star, like Daniel 12, those who sleep in the dust will arise. Is that their rotted bodies will arise and shine like the stars forever? So that's Daniel 12, which many people date to the Maccabean period. So they're starting to see resurrection as glorification. And that's what I wrote my dissertation on. It's published now as Paul's Ascent to Paradise, if any of you want to read that. Anyway, I just wanted to add that. But I don't know about Joseph. Bart and others have said and debated with Craig Evans. And as Jacob knows, and you know too, Todd, so many of these things, we all speculate, we all wonder, we come up with ideas. Well, what if this is true and this wasn't this? And I like all of that. I think it's good too. What if there's Joseph of Arimathea didn't even exist and that was just invented to explain a tomb, or something like that. But Paul or whoever, 1 Corinthians 15 does say, it's funny that it would add burial. He died and was buried, and on the third day lifted up. right? Lifted up, so, or raised. The two are equivalent. So,
and I would like to say this though: the archaeology of the Judgment Gate in Golgotha is documented, and
yeah, it is.
Bible Hill looks like the top of a gigantic skull cap sticking up out of the ground.
Yeah,
and it
I
was
think
called
that's,
a head all the way back in the Old Testament, and it's called a head in the traditional name for it in Arabic. There is a cave on the northern slope of Bible Hill with all kinds of strange and bizarre artifacts that point toward strange and bizarre things happening there. There are pit graves with Roman coins where people were thrown and buried ingloriously. And there are tombs of wealthy Jerusalemites all around Bible Hill. So what I think is, as I said
it's a
before,
good summary. I'll go with you. 51.
so you can go all the way with Joseph of Arimathea, just like the Gospels say, all the way. Or you can have Jesus thrown like a dog into one of those pit graves, and he's still raised up on the third day, just like Paul said. I mean, he was technically buried. Paul didn't say what kind of burial he got. He was buried. So what's fascinating about Bible Hill to me is that no matter what you do, the evidence just keeps fitting the history. And you could even say like those tombs that were surrounding Bible Hill are what inspired the later stories that were hyperbole, if you want to look at it that way. Or you can say that one of those tombs really did belong to Joseph of Arimathea, and the Gospels are telling you exactly the way it went down. Either way, the evidence is just so interconnected, and that's.
Well, we'll send Bart a
I
copy.
think Dr. Tabor found Calvary. I really do. I think he found it.
Well, I haven't given all my reasoning for the Mount of Olives, but I'll say I'm 51% leaning your way, Todd. How about that? 1%. There you go. That's the majority.
And I want to say one other thing about Dr. Tabor. When people say, well, you have this Calvary or that Calvary, this and that, do you know how many light bulbs were on Thomas Edison's floor before he finally got the right one to work? A lot. So, the fact that you have.
What I'm trying to do in all of this, because we have such a diverse audience on YouTube, which is great. And as long as people are respectful and so forth, that everything from none of this is remotely historical to all of it is exactly how it happened, which is a little hard to take since the accounts don't agree. But in the final analysis, what archaeology can do is to try to specify possibilities that are logically in that background. But then finally, my students, everybody I've been teaching for 40 plus years, always ask, well, what if this, and have you ever thought of that? And I love that kind of thing. But, Jacob and Derek were on recently 2 different shows. I don't think Jacob's yet got his whole view out, but a lot of it is, what about this? What about that? If you do this, if you do that. But that's what we do with these materials. My book on Mary was reviewed in the New York Review of Books. It wasn't a favorable review particularly, which is fine. But at the end, the reviewer said, I think you would learn more going to church than from Tabor's book. I consider that a really revealing statement, because what it basically says is, go to church on Easter, listen to whatever text is chosen for the reading, because you got 5 counting the Gospel of Peter. We have 5 narratives of what happened. And that would be better than trying to speculate like he does. And of course I speculate on Mary. I've only got 12 verses that mention her. So how am I going to write a book? By contextualizing things. And that's what you've done. But I think you've done an amazing job. I would have never gotten to a book on this. And I hope a lot of people read your book and consider it. So
there is a couple of super chats. Todd, did you want to say something real quick?
My book may be the first book to cite the Lost Mary. I wonder if I'm the first one.
Could be.
All right, we'll start with Bakken. Thank you for your super chat. It is off topic, but anyway, Acts has Ananias who converts Paul and baptizes him. Is this not the same man who killed John, Jesus, and Jude? Paul received letters to kill. Could you talk about the high priest's relationship to Rome?
I don't know that Ananias in Acts, that would be in Acts 9, I guess, when he's supposedly on the road to Damascus. Is Annas the high priest? The name means grace, Hanan and Anan and so forth. It's pretty common. John, Jesus, and Jude. Is this John the Apostle? Not John the Baptizer, right? That's Herod Antipas.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I think those are probably all different. And as far as who killed Jude, I don't know what the tradition is on that offhand. But the Annas, the high priest, the father is Annas, and then there's Annas, son of Annas, and then there are 4 other priests, plus Caiaphas, a son-in-law. So 6 altogether. It's a kind of a mafia priesthood that runs the first century economic and religious system, likely Sadducean primarily. So I don't think those are all the same. Hope that helps.
Andrew Gooding, thank you for becoming a member. Appreciate it. Steve M, thank you for your super chat. Why would Pilate let a seditionist be taken down?
Just the only reason I can think of is maybe he thought he was about like somebody on Times Square carrying a placard around saying, the end of the world is near or something. There's every interpretation from Brandon to Reza Aslan about being a militant, to just being a harmless fool that has a following, just maybe not harmless in the sense of ideas, but maybe not interested in revolt as much as a different kind of revolution. That would be Crossan's view, I think. But again, seditionist is the key. I think Dom Crossan would make the point that the sedition had to do with the disruption of the culture, primarily rich, poor, male, female, slave, and free. That there's this attempt to create this egalitarian movement that is communist with a small c, if you don't mind me using that word, communal living, and something like we've had throughout American history too. Devoted communities that withdraw and try to bridge all those barriers, and all for one and one for all and so forth. And the David Koresh community I'm most familiar with had some of those similar ideas. People would sell what they have, move and join the community. There seems to be that going on at all levels in the Gospels, particularly in Mark, where Peter says, we've left everything. What's going to happen? And he says, well, you're going to get in this age houses, lands, everything. So he thinks there's going to be some sort of a takeover. You're going to get up plenty. And in the world to come, eternal life. Now, whether Mark said that on his own or Jesus said something like that, But I think Don Crossan has made a good case that the revolutionary part of Jesus is this disruption of stratification in Roman society. The best parallel I could think of today would be British society, where 100 years ago, there's such a protocol for everything, right? Not just royalty, but everything in the culture. What schools you go to, who gets to go to Eton College, who gets to do this and that. And America, the United States, had a lot of that too in the revolutionary times, but ideally we're supposed to be, except for horrible treatment of African Americans and indigenous Americans, anybody can do anything. You know, that old thing, like you tell a 5-year-old kid, you can be president of the United States, you know? Okay. Nobody said that in Britain. You can be a wealthy aristocrat, but you can't enter the culture. And so anytime you have I mentioned the Taborites earlier, the Taborites in the Czech Republic, they wanted to rebuild the same society Jesus had in Tabor, Czech Republic. It's the largest city in the Czech Republic, next to Prague, but nobody's ever heard of it. You can go there. I've been there because I think that's where my ancestors are buried. But why were they a threat to the Habsburgs? Say, well, they had these ideas, Protestant ideas before Luther, but they had, no, it's because John Huss took the mass, he's a priest, out of the church, took it outside the church, set up a table, and got loaves of bread and pitchers of wine, and said to the filthy mob crowds, if you know what I mean, you know, the hoi polloi, the people outside, come you people of Christ, eat and drink the feast of the Lord. That's the threat. These common unwashed masses are going to like walk up and start touching the table and picking up the bread themselves instead of doing a mass ceremony presided over by officials with costumes on. You see the idea? And that's why they had to get rid of him. And Huss was educated. He had the equivalent of what we'd call today a doctorate. And he was burnt at the stake, finally. So I think it's this disruption of society as much as sedition. But that's sedition. That's disrupting society. That's my long answer.
I have a couple of more questions before we close.
Okay.
The first of those last two questions is the Caiaphas, the archaeological evidence, ossuaries and stuff regarding the high priest Caiaphas. Does any of that play a significant role in the book? And if so, what can you tell us about that?
Yes. So the traditional site of Caiaphas's country estate is right across the street from Bible Hill on Abu Tor. And one tradition has Judas Iscariot going there to betray Jesus. Mm-hmm. And just down near, on the same hill that's across the street from Bible Hill is where the Caiaphas ossuary was discovered, which provides evidence for the historicity of the traditions connecting Caiaphas to the hill right across the street from Bible Hill. Otherwise, those traditions wouldn't have anything backing them up. But that hard evidence that we found with the ossuary provides artifacts that back up the tradition, tying Caiaphas to the hill right across from Bible Hill. And what I point out,
the other thing was nails.
Yeah, in his family tomb are the nails of two crucifixes. According to many scholars, the nails found with the Caiaphas ossuary were used in crucifixions. And in the book, I also talk about how some people dispute that because of the type of wood that was found on there. However, if you're using big Latin style crosses to make a statement to the people that you don't mess with Rome, then you would use expensive wood to crucify people. And
well, the study of the nails was done by us, meaning Simca Jacobovici and I and our team. And he's the one who even found the nails. And Hershkovitz did the study at Tel Aviv University, Israel Hershkovitz. And the wood is, I don't think the wood's a problem at all. It's a cypress wood, so that's fine. Could even be a tree. But it does have human DNA. The nails have DNA. And we did the DNA already on the nails, but it was the old method, the Sanger method from 20 years ago, and it doesn't give you much. But the plan now is to do the new generation sequencing DNA, and sometimes from the tiniest bit of remains, you can get the haplogroup, which is the basic, really tell you what the person's from and so forth, and maybe other positions on the DNA chain. So that's all been stopped by Gaza and by the war, because the Gaza thing with the 15,000 rockets fired into the civilian population, and now Iran even this morning firing dozens and dozens of missiles and drones. But all of those things are still, those nails were lost. If you've watched the documentary on that, they were misplaced. Nobody knew where they were. Israel Antiquities Authority didn't keep them. But then they were discovered in the lab of the anthropologist Niku Haas, who had sent them to Tel Aviv, but they weren't identified till we started. It's mostly Simca. I'm not claiming I did this, but I was involved in it and poking around, so to speak. And Hershkovitz said, well, wait a minute. I received this box of 2 nails, and they matched the same. They're for the hands. They're not for the feet. So they're about half this size, like that. And you put them not in the wrist, but in the back of the hand, like this. And then you bend them over like a hook. So you embed them into the wood about 1.5 inches, 2 inches, and then you hook. And then to keep the body is tied, actually. Got a button in my shirt here. The body's tied. The weight of the body is being held by ropes at the elbows. But you will start, if you're up on a cross for 2 or 3 days, those ropes will loosen and you could start moving your hands. But those nails are not to support the body. Those little nails wouldn't hold up a body, just pull right out. But you cannot move your hands. You put we have 4 nails. 2 are with Antigonus, and they're both in his hand. Antigonus, the last Ashmonean king. And the other 2 were in the Caiaphas tomb. So that's interesting, let's just say, to do further studies on those. I would say, I hope by next year we can have all these results. There are some new DNA results on the Shroud of Turin for those that are interested. It was just published last week. So you can Google that. I'm not going to go into that right now, but Jacob and I will probably, we've already talked a lot about the Shroud. We'll probably talk about that when we can learn a bit more about it. It's brand new, but we are getting some haplogroup readings from those. So we're in a time where some of this could be filled in, no matter whether you think Joseph existed or didn't exist, or Caiaphas. I don't know many people that doubt the existence of Caiaphas, but
I would like to say that there are some scholars that say that Jesus was likely crucified on a living tree. Dr. Ernest Martin made that claim, for example. And in the book, I talk about how there are some trees on Bible Hill now. So he could have been crucified on a living tree at Bible Hill. So
Yeah,
if you don't go, you could go with a
the term
small
is
cross,
just
a big
wood.
Latin cross, a living tree.
Right.
It all could have happened up there.
Yeah,
which
the
is,
term
is
stauros, it just means stake, of course, as the Jehovah's Witnesses tell us all the time. It means stake. And staroo is to stake somebody, put them on a stake. But the worst way to do that is in the reliefs that you've seen that the Assyrians used, and you literally just take the person from the butt on and put them on a stake. That's not what we call crucifixion. But the other term is wood. It's just the word wood. Xylon or zulon, and it just means you're put on the wood. So nails help, and your nails and urns are very important at this site, because anybody that's keeping nails in cremated urns is kind of like Caiaphas keeping crucifixion nails in his tomb. It wards off evil. They're extremely powerful. I don't know if you know, but in the Talmud, they talk about what you can carry on the Sabbath. Like a tailor cannot carry his needle, let's say, in the lapel or the part of his garment. Like you might put during the workday, you've got your needles on your robe, where you can grab them. On the Sabbath, why can't he carry a needle? Are you kidding? Because that's his tool of trade. So it's symbolic. Like my tool of trade is sewing, so I don't carry my sewing machine around on the Sabbath. And they say, well, wait, there's one thing you can carry, right? You know what it is? Anybody know? You can carry a crucifixion nail on the Sabbath. Now, this is all of it. This goes, it's late. It's I think it's the Jerusalem Talmud, so 300 AD. But you see the idea again is, crucifixion now, that's different, because that's protecting you from evil. And it's widespread in the Greco-Roman world, not just, in the land of Israel. You said there was another question, or did we do that?
Yes, there is one more question. Before I get to it, we do have another super chat.
Okay.
Torah, thank you for your super chat. I would like to ask Dr. James if he is familiar with John Allegro's work in regards to the Dead Sea Scrolls. He said in the documentation, there was a figure called the Teacher of Righteousness who was crucified around 88 BC of Zadokhi.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't read Allegro in a while, but this idea of somebody crucified in that period is in some of our texts, and there's even a Yeshua, I believe, Joshua. But I couldn't answer off the top of my head. But he did tend to have challenging theories that were not mainstream, but he also thought the Shapira scroll was authentic, not a forgery. He also thought that the Jesus movement took mushrooms and achieved their visions, like ascending to heaven and so forth. And he had lots of views, but he also worked a lot on the Copper Scroll. But that's the only answer I could give at this point without rereading what he said.
So for my final question, so when you put all the evidence together, Todd, would you say that the way I want to put this question is, the gospel accounts, they do differ from one another in terms of a little bit on the crucifixion story, among other things. Does the evidence sometimes confirm accounts that's not just in Mark, but in one of the other gospels that may conflict with Mark or embellish Mark? And sometimes does the evidence also confirm Mark? Does it kind of work like that?
That's an interesting question. And that's going to bring up Cave 34 and the pit graves again. Because according to the Gospel of Mark, for example, according to the Gospel of Mark, what happens to Jesus's body? It's put in a cave. And what happens after that in the Gospel of Mark? You know the answer. The women run away, and that's the end of the gospel.
Oh, don't they find
the Gospel of Mark is the oldest gospel? So and again, what's interesting is that if Bible Hill also has all the archaeological evidence to support. You can interpret Bible Hill according to Bible Hill. Bible Hill has all the evidence that supports the Gospels and can account for contradictions.
Let's just say everything
on an intellectual level. In other words, I am not a fundamentalist, and I don't read the Bible as a fundamentalist. In fact, without contradictions, I would think the whole thing was fake. I can be in the same room with somebody else and we see the same thing. And when we write down what we saw, if there aren't contradictions or seeming contradictions, then something's wrong, because human beings cannot observe the same thing and remember, have instant perfect recall and have everything match. So when you're reading the Gospels, let me give you an example. Bible Hill could withstand an earthquake during the crucifixion. If you think that happened, it could withstand an earthquake, and the stipes would still be standing straight up, solid as ever. Now, I'm not saying that an earthquake really happened. Maybe that was hyperbole. Maybe that was Matthew trying to get his audience pumped up about Jesus. Or maybe it really literally happened. I don't know. But what I do know is that either way, Bible Hill could take an earthquake during the middle of the crucifixion. And it's not up to, I will never know. I will never know what was hyperbole, what was exaggerated, what was fact, whether it was exactly the way it was written. I don't know that kind of stuff. I'll never know. But
also,
I do know that I use these Gospels as a guide. I do draw the line, though, in that these Gospels are the earliest sources of information that we have. And a lot of people were alive that witnessed the crucifixion and that knew Jesus and knew Caiaphas and knew all of these sorts of things. So any Gospels beyond John, you could get away with some serious exaggeration and or even lies. But before that, you're going to have to be held accountable for what you write, because there are enemies of the Christian movement out there that will call you out. So, I could say Matthew would probably say, yeah, back in those days, people wrote hyperbole and stuff like that all the time. So even let's say that he added the earthquake to make his gospel a little more exciting. He'd probably say, well, the Bible is full of those kind of things. Do you think that Jonah was inside of a whale in his digestive tract for 3 days? Eaten by stomach acids and stuff. Of course, the dude would have been dead as dirt. But
I'm going to have to.
The point of the Jonah story is about a lesson of faith in God and doing what is right, and these sorts of things. So I think Matthew would have said, why are you even let's say the earthquake didn't happen. Matthew would say, why are you even interpreting that in the first place? But then again, I can't prove an earthquake didn't happen. Maybe there was a minor tremor that he exaggerated a little bit to make it cooler. So an earthquake technically happened. But either way, that Bible Hill is still standing, and it looks like a gigantic skull cap sticking up out of the ground, and it has withstood earthquakes for centuries and centuries and centuries. So if there was a minor tremor or a major earthquake during the crucifixion, Bible Hill would have stood the test, and Jesus would have still been up on that cross. And I hope that makes sense, what I'm saying.
I've got to go, Jacob. I don't think.
I hear you. I'm going to go ahead and play the outro because I think Todd finished his question.
Yeah, I do want to say on the earthquake, though, it's mentioned by Josephus that 40 years before the temple fell, the lintel holding the curtain of the Herodian temple cracked and the curtain fell down. And you could take that either way, that whoever wrote about the earthquake read Josephus and said, well, that'll be a cool thing to put in. And, because 30 years around the time of Jesus, or that there was an earthquake. Now, remember, Josephus wasn't even born, so he's passing along something that he heard, right? So, yeah, I just I haven't had lunch yet, and it's 5 o'clock Eastern time, so I'm going to, you're going to play the outro. But thanks, Jacob, for having us, and it's a very interesting subject. Todd, you did a clear job.
Jacob Ehrman is a professional par excellence, and I have enjoyed and learned a lot from your show over the years. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Todd. And James and Todd, thank you both for joining me today. And just want to remind everybody real quick that the link to purchase Todd's book will be in the description below in the pinned comment, and including to James's YouTube channel, which will also be tagged in the description below, and the link to it will be in the pinned comment. So again, thank you both for joining me today.
Yeah.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.